The police officer looked at me with complete confusion as Karen stood behind him, arms crossed, wearing that smug smile I had grown to hate. She pointed at my mailbox like it was evidence of some terrible crime. "This is it, officer. This is the violation I told you about. Wrong color, completely against our HOA rules." I watched her face, knowing what she did not know, what none of them knew. As she rattled off her list of complaints about my property, my car, my lawn, I felt something shift inside me. This woman had been terrorizing me for months, calling the police, threatening legal action, making my life hell over the color of my mailbox. But Karen had made one critical mistake. In all her research, all her HOA rule checking, all her legal threats, she never bothered to find out who actually owned the land she was standing on. That is when I realized they built 96 homes on my land. 6 months ago, my life was peaceful. I lived in the same house my grandfather left me when he passed, a modest two-story home with a wraparound porch and a garden that bloomed every spring without fail. The property sat on 2 acres of land that backed up to a small creek, surrounded by tall oak trees that had been there longer than anyone could remember. My grandfather, William, had been a quiet man who kept to himself, but treated everyone with respect. He bought this land back in 1987, long before anyone thought about building fancy developments or forming homeowner associations. Back then, this area was mostly farmland and empty lots. People minded their own business and took care of their own property. Everything changed when the developers arrived 3 years ago. Almost overnight, the empty fields around my house transformed into a sprawling subdivision called Oakwood Estates. 96 identical houses appeared like mushrooms after rain, each one painted in approved beige or cream colors with matching driveways and manicured lawns. At first, I thought having neighbors might be nice. The isolation had gotten to me sometimes, especially after Grandpa died. I imagined friendly faces, maybe borrowing sugar or having barbecues. I was wrong. The trouble started when the new residents decided they needed an HOA. I received a letter in my mailbox one Tuesday morning, printed on official-looking letterhead with the Oakwood Estates logo. It informed me that I was now subject to the rules and regulations of the newly formed homeowner association, effective immediately. I remember staring at that letter, confused. My house predated their entire development. My mailbox had been the same forest green color for 15 years. My garden grew wild flowers and vegetables, not the approved decorative plants listed in their handbook. That is when I met Karen. Karen Mitchell appointed herself as the HOA president before anyone else could volunteer. She was a woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled blonde hair and a wardrobe that screamed suburban authority. She carried a clipboard everywhere she went, like some kind of neighborhood inspector general. I first saw her walking through the development on a Saturday morning, stopping at houses to take pictures of violations. A kid's bike left on a lawn, a trash can visible from the street, a car parked slightly crooked in a driveway. Each infraction got documented with the efficiency of a police investigation. Karen ruled over Oakwood Estates like it was her personal kingdom. She organized monthly HOA meetings in the community center, where she would read from her violation reports with the dramatic flair of a prosecutor presenting evidence. Neighbors who dared to question her authority found themselves facing increasingly harsh scrutiny of their own properties. The first time Karen knocked on my door, she wore a bright smile that did not reach her eyes. "Hello there. I am Karen Mitchell, president of the Oakwood Estates HOA. I wanted to introduce myself and discuss some concerns about your property." I invited her in for coffee, thinking we could have a reasonable conversation. She declined the coffee but spent 20 minutes walking around my house, taking notes on everything from my paint colors to the height of my grass. "This mailbox will need to be changed," she said, tapping her pen against my front porch railing. "Green is not an approved color, and your garden, well, we will need to discuss appropriate landscaping standards." I tried to explain that my house existed before their HOA, that I had never agreed to join their association. Karen listened with the patronizing smile of someone humoring a confused child. "Oh, honey, that does not matter. Your property falls within our established boundaries. Everyone in Oakwood Estates follows the same rules. That is what makes our community special." She handed me a thick packet of HOA rules and regulations, along with a list of required modifications to bring my property into compliance. As I watched her walk away, clipboard in hand, I felt the first stirrings of something I had not experienced in years. Anger. Pure, hot anger at the audacity of this woman who had appeared in my peaceful life and decided she had the right to change everything. I had no idea that Karen was about to learn the hardest lesson of her life, about assuming authority over things she did not understand. The violation notices started arriving within a week. The first one was for my mailbox color. According to HOA standards, all mailboxes must be black, white, or bronze. My forest green mailbox, which had weathered 15 years of storms without complaint, was now a visual disruption to community standards. The second notice came 2 days later. My garden violated the approved landscaping guidelines. Instead of the uniform shrubs and mulched flower beds that decorated every other house in the development, I grew tomatoes, herbs, and wildflowers. Karen deemed this agricultural activity inappropriate for residential areas. The third notice was for my car. I drove a 15-year-old pickup truck that I parked in my driveway exactly where it had been parked for over a decade. Suddenly, this violated the vehicle appearance standards because of a small rust spot on the tailgate. Each violation notice came with a deadline for compliance and threats of escalating fines. Karen signed every single one with a flourish. Her title, HOA President, printed in bold letters below her name. I decided to try reasoning with her one more time. I called the number on the letterhead and asked for a meeting to discuss my situation. Karen agreed to meet me at the community center on a Thursday evening. She arrived with 2 other HOA board members, Tom and Sandra, both newer residents who seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation. Karen, however, radiated confidence as she spread my file across the table like evidence in a trial. "I appreciate you taking the time to address these issues properly," she began, not waiting for me to speak. "Compliance with HOA standards is essential for maintaining property values throughout our community." I pulled out copies of my property deed and tax records, documents that clearly showed the age and history of my land. "Karen, I think there has been a misunderstanding. My property predates your HOA by decades. My grandfather bought this land in 1987, long before Oakwood Estates existed." Karen barely glanced at my papers. "That is irrelevant. Your property sits within our HOA boundaries. Everyone in this community follows the same rules, regardless of when they moved here." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Maybe we should look at those documents." "There is nothing to look at," Karen interrupted sharply. "The rules apply to everyone equally. That is what fairness means." I tried a different approach. What if we could work out some kind of compromise? maybe grandfather my existing features while agreeing to certain standards for future changes. Karen's smile turned cold. There are no compromises when it comes to community standards. You have 30 days to comply with all violations, or we will be forced to take legal action. She stood up abruptly, gathering her papers. I have been more than patient with your situation. Other residents have been complaining about the appearance of your property. They moved here for a certain quality of life, and I intend to protect that. As she walked toward the door, she turned back with that same patronizing smile. I suggest you contact a contractor about that mailbox. Black would look lovely with your house color. That night, I discovered just how far Karen had gone to build support for her campaign against me. My neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who lived in the house closest to mine, knocked on my door around 8 o'clock. "I wanted you to know what that woman has been saying about you," she whispered, glancing around nervously. "She told everyone at the last HOA meeting that you were being deliberately defiant, that you think you are above the rules because your house is older." Mrs. Patterson had moved to Oakwood Estates to be closer to her daughter, but found herself caught in Karen's web of neighborhood politics. She said you were lowering everyone's property values and that legal action might be necessary to force compliance. The lies hurt worse than the violation notices. Karen was not just attacking my property. She was attacking my character, painting me as some kind of troublemaker who refused to be a good neighbor. 2 weeks later, Karen made her biggest escalation yet. I was working in my garden on a Saturday morning when a white van pulled into my driveway. A city code enforcement officer climbed out, carrying an official-looking clipboard that reminded me painfully of Karen's constant accessory. "Sir, I need to inspect your property for possible code violations. We received a complaint about unpermitted structures and potential health hazards." I walked him around my property, showing him the shed my grandfather had built 20 years ago, the garden that grew the same vegetables every year, the compost bin tucked discreetly behind the garage. Everything was legal, properly maintained, and obviously established long before any HOA existed. The officer was professional but seemed confused. "Honestly, sir, I do not see any violations here. Whoever called this in may have misunderstood what constitutes a code violation." As he drove away, I saw Karen standing in her front yard 3 houses down, watching through binoculars. She lowered them when she realized I had noticed her, but the damage was done. She had called the city on me with false complaints, hoping to use government authority to force me into submission. That evening, as I sat on my porch watching the sunset through the oak trees, I made a decision that would change everything. I was done being reasonable. I was done trying to compromise with someone who had no interest in fairness or community harmony. Karen wanted a war. She was about to get one. I started my research the next morning with a cup of coffee and my grandfather's old file cabinet. William had been meticulous about keeping records. Every receipt, every contract, every legal document had been carefully filed and labeled in his precise handwriting. The property deed was exactly where I expected to find it, in a folder marked House Legal Documents. But as I read through the papers more carefully than I ever had before, I noticed something strange. The legal description of the property included coordinates and boundary markers that seemed to extend far beyond what I thought were my property lines. I spent the weekend walking my land with the deed in hand, trying to match the legal description to the actual terrain. The boundaries described in the document extended past the creek, past the oak trees, into areas that were now occupied by Oakwood Estates houses. This had to be a mistake. Property records from the 1980s were sometimes imprecise, and surveyors occasionally made errors. But the more I studied the documents, the more convinced I became that something significant had been overlooked. Monday morning, I drove to the county courthouse to research the full history of my land. The records clerk, a patient woman named Martha who had worked there for 30 years, helped me navigate the complex filing system. "What exactly are you looking for, honey?" she asked as she pulled out boxes of archived documents. "I need to understand the complete ownership history of this property," I said, showing her my address. "Specifically, what happened when the surrounding land was developed." Martha's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved property research. "Oh, this is interesting. Let me pull the development files for Oakwood Estates too. Sometimes the stories these documents tell are quite surprising." What we discovered over the next 4 hours changed everything. My grandfather had not just owned 2 acres around the house. According to the original 1987 deed, William had purchased 43 acres of farmland. The property extended in all directions from the house, encompassing the entire area that now housed Oakwood Estates. But here is where it got complicated. In 1992, my grandfather had sold development rights to portions of his land to a company called Heartland Development Group. The contract was complex, full of legal language that took me several readings to understand. Essentially, grandfather had sold the right to develop the land for residential use while retaining ownership of the underlying property. The development company could build houses and sell them to buyers, but the land itself remained legally owned by William Patterson and his heirs. Martha helped me trace the paper trail through multiple sales and transfers. Heartland Development had sold the development project to another company, which had eventually sold it to the current developers. But in all these transfers, no one had ever acquired actual ownership of the land itself. "This is what we call a development rights sale," Martha explained, pulling out a diagram to illustrate the concept. "Your grandfather was very smart. He got paid for allowing development while keeping ownership of the property. The homeowners own their houses and immediate yards, but the common areas, the streets, even parts of their lots technically belong to you." I stared at the document spread across the table, my mind racing. "Are you saying that Karen's HOA has been operating on land they do not own?" Martha nodded slowly. "That would be my interpretation. And if they never properly researched the title history before forming their association, they may have been operating without proper legal authority this entire time." I spent the rest of the week consulting with a property law attorney named Robert Chen. He reviewed all my documents with the careful attention of someone who understood the massive implications of what we had uncovered. "This is extraordinary," he said during our second meeting. "Your grandfather structured this deal to protect your family's long-term interests. The developers got what they needed to build and sell houses, but you retained control over the fundamental ownership of the property." Robert explained that HOAs typically acquire their authority through agreements with property developers or through legal structures established when a community is built. But if the developers never actually owned the land, they could not have legally granted HOA authority over it. "What does this mean for me practically?" I asked. Robert leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It means, if you choose to exercise your rights, you have the legal authority to dissolve their HOA entirely. The common areas they think they control, yours. The standards they think they can enforce. They have no legal basis for any of it." As I drove home that evening, My mind was spinning with possibilities. I could end Karen's reign of terror with a single legal filing. I could dissolve the HOA and free every resident from her petty tyranny. But something Robert had said stuck with me. If you choose to exercise your rights. The question was not whether I could stop Karen. The question was how far I was willing to go to make sure she never had the power to hurt anyone again. As I pulled into my driveway and saw another violation notice stuck to my front door, this one threatening immediate legal action for my continued noncompliance, I knew exactly what I was going to do. Karen had picked the wrong person to bully. She was about to learn that some battles should never be started if you cannot afford to lose them. The next phase of my plan required something I had never possessed before: patience. Robert Chen had confirmed my legal position was unshakable, but he also advised strategic timing for maximum impact. Karen is clearly someone who escalates conflicts, he observed during our third meeting. Let her continue digging herself into a deeper hole. Every threat she makes, every violation notice she sends, every legal claim she files will just make her eventual downfall more complete. So I decided to let Karen be Karen. The violation notices kept coming, each one more ridiculous than the last. My garden hose, coiled neatly beside my house for 20 years, suddenly violated equipment storage guidelines. The bird feeder that attracted cardinals and blue jays to my backyard was deemed an unapproved structure. Even my doormat, a simple brown mat with "Welcome" printed in faded letters, became a violation for not matching the approved entry-decor standards. I documented everything. Every notice, every threat, every interaction got photographed, scanned, and filed in a growing folder that Robert called evidence of harassment. Karen's own words would become the foundation of any legal action we might need to take. The harassment escalated beyond simple paperwork. Karen organized what she called community compliance walks, where she would lead groups of HOA board members through the neighborhood, stopping at houses to take pictures of violations. My property always received special attention during these tours. I watched from my kitchen window as Karen pointed at my house, gesturing dramatically while her followers nodded along. She held her clipboard like a shield and her camera like a weapon, documenting every perceived infraction with the dedication of a war correspondent. Mrs. Patterson continued to keep me informed about what Karen was saying behind my back. The lies grew more elaborate with each HOA meeting. According to Karen, I was planning to turn my property into a commercial farm. She claimed I was deliberately lowering property values out of spite. She even suggested I might be mentally unstable, unable to accept the reality of living in a modern community. She told everyone that legal action was the only option left, Mrs. Patterson whispered during one of our fence line conversations. She said you have given her no choice but to force compliance through the courts. This was exactly what Robert and I had been waiting for. Karen's biggest mistake came in the form of an official letter delivered by certified mail. The envelope bore the letterhead of Mitchell and Associates Legal Services, which I later discovered was not a law firm, but rather Karen's own consulting business that she had created specifically to intimidate HOA residents. The letter was a masterpiece of legal-sounding nonsense, full of phrases like willful noncompliance and community standards violations and mandatory corrective action. It threatened liens against my property, forced compliance through court orders, and even suggested the possibility of having my house condemned as a public nuisance. But the most beautiful part of Karen's letter was the claim that gave me everything I needed. The Oakwood Estates HOA has full legal authority over all properties within the development boundaries, including the authority to enforce compliance through any means necessary. Robert laughed out loud when I showed him the letter. She just made a legal claim about authority she does not possess. This is perfect. Karen was not finished. Her final escalation came on a Tuesday evening when I was working late in my garden. I heard car doors slamming and looked up to see two police officers walking toward my house, with Karen trailing behind them like a prosecutor leading investigators to a crime scene. The senior officer, a professional man who clearly did not want to be there, approached me with obvious reluctance. "Sir, we received a complaint about trespassing and property violations. The caller claims you are using common area property without permission and refusing to comply with legal orders." I wiped my hands on my jeans and looked past the officer to where Karen stood, arms crossed, wearing that same smug expression I had grown to despise. "Officers, I think there has been some confusion about who owns what property around here," I said calmly. "Would you like to see my property deed?" Karen stepped forward before the officers could respond. "That is irrelevant. He is violating HOA standards and trespassing on common area land. I have the authority to request his removal." The police officers looked uncomfortable with the situation. After reviewing my property documents and walking the boundaries with me, they concluded that no crimes had been committed and no trespassing had occurred. As they prepared to leave, the senior officer turned to Karen with barely concealed irritation. "Ma'am, in the future, please make sure you understand the legal situation before calling us about property disputes. This appears to be a civil matter, not a criminal one." Karen's face flushed red as the officers drove away, but her humiliation only seemed to fuel her determination. That night I received a text message from Tom, one of the other HOA board members. "Emergency meeting tomorrow night. Karen says it is time for final action." I smiled as I forwarded the message to Robert. The trap was set, and Karen was about to walk right into it. The emergency meeting would be the perfect stage for the revelation that would end Karen's reign once and for all. The Oakwood Estates Community Center had never hosted a more tense gathering. Every seat was filled, with residents standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. Word had spread that tonight's emergency meeting would finally resolve the situation with the problem property that had been disrupting their perfect community. Karen stood at the front of the room like a general addressing troops before battle. She had dressed for the occasion in a sharp business suit, her hair styled with extra care, her clipboard replaced by a leather portfolio that she clutched like a weapon. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who believed herself to be completely in control. "We are here to address a serious situation that has gone on far too long." I sat in the back row, Robert Chen beside me with his own leather briefcase resting calmly on his lap. We had arrived early, but Karen had been too busy organizing her presentation to notice us. "For months, I have tried to work with a resident who refuses to follow our community standards," Karen continued, clicking through PowerPoint slides that showed pictures of my house, my garden, my mailbox. "Despite numerous warnings, violation notices, and opportunities to comply, this individual continues to show complete disregard for our HOA authority." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Karen had done her work well, turning most of the residents against me through months of lies and manipulation. "Tonight, I am asking for your support to take the strongest possible action. We will file liens against the property, seek court orders for forced compliance, and if necessary, pursue legal remedies up to and including foreclosure. The room erupted in applause. Karen basked in the approval, her smile growing wider as she mistook their support for validation of her authority. "Are there any questions before we take a formal vote?" she asked, scanning the room with the confidence of someone who believed the outcome was predetermined. I stood up slowly, and the room fell silent. "I have a question, Karen." Her smile faltered slightly when she saw me, but she recovered quickly. "Of course. I am sure we can address any final concerns you might have before we proceed." I walked to the front of the room, Robert following with his briefcase. Every eye in the room tracked our movement, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. "My question is simple," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "What gives you the legal authority to make any of these threats?" Karen's confidence returned in full force. "The Oakwood Estates HOA has full authority over all properties within our development boundaries. That authority was established when the community was created, and it applies to every resident regardless of when they moved here." "That is interesting," I replied, "because I have spent considerable time researching the legal foundation of your claimed authority, and I think everyone here deserves to know what I discovered." I nodded to Robert, who opened his briefcase and removed a thick stack of legal documents. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert announced in his clear attorney voice, "my name is Robert Chen, and I represent the property owner you have all been discussing tonight. I am here to share some important information about the legal status of your HOA." Karen's face had gone pale, but she was not backing down. "This is completely inappropriate. We are not going to be intimidated by legal theatrics." "These are not theatrics," Robert replied calmly. "These are facts." He held up the first document. "This is the original property deed from 1987, showing that William Patterson purchased 43 acres of land, including all the property that now comprises Oakwood Estates." Confused murmurs started throughout the room. Karen shook her head dismissively. "That is ancient history. The land was obviously sold to developers who created our community." Robert smiled. "That is where you are wrong. The land was not sold. Development rights were sold, but ownership of the underlying property was retained by William Patterson and his heirs." He produced another document. "This is the development rights contract from 1992. It explicitly states that while Heartland Development Group acquired the right to build residential structures, ownership of the land itself remained with the Patterson family." The room was dead silent now, everyone trying to process what they were hearing. "What this means," Robert continued, "is that every common area your HOA claims to control, every street you think you maintain, every rule you believe you have the authority to enforce, exists on property owned by my client." Karen's voice cracked when she spoke. That is impossible. Our lawyers reviewed everything when we formed the HOA." "Did they?" Robert asked. "Because I have been unable to find any record of a proper title search being conducted. It appears your HOA was formed based on assumptions rather than legal research." I stepped forward, addressing the room directly. "For months, Karen has been threatening me with legal action, claiming authority she does not possess. She has harassed me, lied about me to my neighbors, and called the police with false complaints, all while operating an HOA that has no legal right to exist." The weight of the revelation was sinking in throughout the room. Residents looked at each other with growing alarm as they realized the implications. Tom, one of the board members, found his voice first. "Are you saying our HOA is illegal?" I am saying your HOA was formed without proper legal authority, Robert replied. Every rule you have enforced, every fine you have collected, every decision your board has made regarding common areas has been done without legal basis. Karen finally exploded. This is ridiculous. I have spent 2 years building this community, maintaining our standards, protecting everyone's property values. You cannot just come in here with old paperwork and destroy everything we have worked for. Actually, I said quietly, I can. The room erupted in chaos as the full implications hit everyone at once. Some residents shouted questions, others argued among themselves, and a few began demanding answers from Karen about how she could have made such a massive oversight. But through all the noise, I watched Karen's face as her world crumbled around her. The authority she had wielded so ruthlessly, the power she had abused so completely, the fear she had used to control her neighbors, all of it was gone in an instant. For the first time since I had met her, Karen looked exactly like what she had always been, a bully who had finally met someone she could not intimidate. The chaos in the community center continued for 20 minutes before people began to leave in small groups, their conversations a mix of shock, anger, and desperate planning. The carefully organized meeting had devolved into something that looked more like a disaster response. Karen remained at the front of the room, refusing to accept what had just happened. As residents filed out, many of them shot angry looks in her direction. The authority she had wielded so confidently was evaporating before her eyes. "This changes nothing," she announced to the dwindling crowd, her voice shrill with desperation. "We will challenge this in court. There has to be some kind of legal remedy. HOAs do not just disappear because of old paperwork." Tom and Sandra, the other board members, approached her with obvious reluctance. "Karen, we need to talk about this situation," Tom said quietly. "If what they are saying is true, we could all be facing personal liability for the decisions we have made." "What they are saying is not true," Karen snapped. "It is a legal trick, some kind of technicality they are using to avoid following community standards." Sandra shook her head. "Karen, I think we need to consult our own attorney before we make any more decisions. This is way beyond anything we are qualified to handle." "I am perfectly qualified to handle this," Karen replied, her voice rising. "I have been managing HOA issues for 2 years. I know what I am doing." But even as she spoke, I could see the doubt creeping into her supporters' faces. The absolute confidence that had made Karen so effective as a neighborhood tyrant was cracking under the weight of legal reality. Over the next few days, the full scope of the situation became clear. Robert helped me understand exactly what options I had as the actual owner of the property. "Technically, you could evict the entire development," he explained during our follow-up meeting. "Every house sits on land you own under a development agreement that was never properly transferred. But that would be extraordinarily disruptive and probably not in anyone's best interest." "What about the HOA itself?" I asked. "The HOA has no legal basis for existence," Robert confirmed. "All their rules, all their enforcement actions, all their financial decisions have been made without proper authority. You could dissolve it immediately." "And Karen?" Robert's expression grew serious. "Karen has been operating under false pretenses for 2 years. She has collected fees, imposed fines, and made legal threats without authority. Depending on how much money has been involved, she could be facing criminal charges for fraud." The community response was swift and brutal. Mrs. Patterson told me that Karen's supporters were abandoning her as quickly as they had rallied to her cause. "People are scared," she explained. They are worried about their property values, their home investments, everything they have built here. And they are angry that Karen never did the basic research that would have prevented this mess. Karen tried to maintain control through increasingly desperate measures. She sent emails to all residents claiming that my legal documents were fake. She organized a counter-meeting to discuss fighting back against property owner intimidation. She even hired her own attorney to challenge my ownership claims. But the legal facts were undeniable. Every attorney who reviewed the situation reached the same conclusion. The Oakwood Estates HOA had been operating without proper legal authority from the moment it was formed. The final blow to Karen's credibility came when her own lawyer advised the remaining board members to dissolve the HOA immediately to avoid further liability. "Your position is legally indefensible," he told them in a meeting that Tom later described to me. "Continuing to operate under these circumstances could expose every board member to personal financial liability." Within a week, Karen found herself completely isolated. The board members resigned en masse. The residents who had supported her began demanding refunds of HOA fees paid under false pretenses. Even her closest allies in the community started avoiding her phone calls. But Karen was not done fighting. In her final act of desperate defiance, she made one last attempt to rally support by claiming I was planning to destroy the community out of spite. She went door to door, warning residents that I intended to tear down houses, eliminate common areas, and turn the entire development into farmland. The lies were so outrageous that even former supporters recognized them as the desperate fabrications of someone who had lost all credibility. As I watched Karen's complete isolation unfold, I faced the biggest decision of this entire ordeal: what to do with the power I had never wanted but now possessed. The choice was mine, and everyone in Oakwood Estates was waiting to see whether I would be merciful or vengeful. The decision I made about the future of Oakwood Estates would define not just my own character, but the kind of community these 96 families would live in for years to come. I could have exercised my full legal rights. I could have dissolved everything, eliminated all community structures, and left every resident to fend for themselves. After months of harassment, lies, and legal threats, the temptation for complete revenge was real. But that would have made me no better than Karen. Instead, I chose a different path. I called a community meeting of my own, held in the same community center where Karen's authority had crumbled just 2 weeks earlier. This time, the atmosphere was completely different. Residents arrived not with anger or excitement, but with nervous hope. "I know everyone has questions about what happens next," I began, standing where Karen had stood when she made her threats. "I want to be clear about my intentions." I explained that while I had the legal right to dissolve their community entirely, I had no desire to destroy the homes and lives people had built in Oakwood Estates. "What I want is very simple," I said. "I want to live peacefully on my property without harassment. I want a community structure that serves everyone fairly, not just whoever happens to be in charge. And I want to make sure that what happened with Karen never happens again." My proposal was straightforward. I would work with interested residents to establish a new community organization with proper legal foundation. This new structure would have reasonable rules, transparent leadership, and most importantly, accountability measures to prevent any future dictators from terrorizing their neighbors. "Anyone who wants to participate in creating this new organization is welcome," I announced. "Anyone who prefers to opt out entirely is free to do so. The choice belongs to each family." The response was overwhelmingly positive. Residents who had lived in fear of Karen's arbitrary enforcement were excited about the possibility of genuine community cooperation. Tom volunteered to help coordinate the transition. Sandra offered to manage communications. Even Mrs. Patterson, despite her age, insisted on joining the planning committee. Karen, predictably, tried one final desperate gambit. She attempted to file legal challenges to my ownership claims, hoping to find some technicality that would restore her authority. Every challenge failed. Her attorney eventually withdrew from representing her, citing her refusal to accept legal reality. The new community organization we created was everything the old HOA was not. Rules were reasonable and clearly defined. Leadership positions were term-limited and regularly elected. Most importantly, every major decision required input from residents rather than dictates from a single person. Karen's attempts at a comeback were pathetic and short-lived. She tried running for the new community board but received only 3 votes, including her own. She attempted to restart violation complaints through city code enforcement, but her previous false reports had destroyed her credibility with authorities. Eventually, Karen did what bullies often do when their power is gone. She moved away. The for sale sign appeared in her yard 3 months after her downfall, and she was gone within 6 weeks. The house sold quickly to a young couple with twin toddlers, who were delighted to find a community that welcomed children playing in yards and neighbors who actually talked to each other. As for me, I returned to the peaceful life I had always wanted. My garden grows wild flowers in.